Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Wherever you're joining us from in the world today, welcome to the final FIDIC webinar of 2024. Today is a very important issue in our industry, and it marks the United Nations International Anti-Corruption Day. Today on this webinar, we're going to be highlighting and demonstrating the importance of undertaking anti-corruption activities at all levels of the construction and infrastructure industry. My name is Richard Stump. In addition to my role as a vice president at RS&H, which is a US headquartered architectural engineering company, I'm also coming to you as the chair of FIDIC's Integrity Management Committee. On behalf of the Integrity Management Committee, the board of directors of FIDIC, the secretariat, and the global FIDIC community, welcome to today's webinar and welcome to a robust conversation on the importance of integrity in the fight against corruption in the built infrastructure environment. Our webinar today is titled Tackling Corruption and Rooting It Out of the Industry. It's been organized by the Integrity Management Committee, and this committee plays a very key role in raising the awareness of the need to fight against corruption in global construction markets. Additionally, the Integrity Management Committee provides FIDIC with an expert resource on integrity-related matters. For the purposes of today's webinar, the committee and FIDIC have teamed up with the leading professional services firm EY. This has been part of a 3-webinar series over the course of 2024, and today is that 3rd webinar. The two organizations have worked together to provide the global community with updates on the issues of integrity as well as anti-corruption for everyone that is working in the construction sector, the infrastructure sector, and the built infrastructure environment. As many of you know, integrity has been a core value of FIDIC from the beginning. And for many years, we've highlighted the need for companies and organizations to put integrity first and at the heart of your operations. It is worth noting that organizations who do this are more resilient, they're more profitable, and they're better able to retain top talent as well as attract new customers, especially during challenging business times. So in summary, a commitment to integrity and being aware and alive to the threat of corruption and fraud is very good for your business. As a reminder, we're really dealing with a problem that needs to be addressed. And as a community, we cannot afford to be complacent. Corruption in the construction industry is a widespread issue. It affects both developed and developing countries. The sector is particularly vulnerable due to the large sums of money involved in projects, their complexity, and the diverse range of stakeholders that are often involved in these projects. Corruption in the construction industry also poses significant risks to economic growth, infrastructure quality, and public trust. In order to effectively address this challenge, a multifaceted approach involving governments, industry players, civil society, and the general public are necessary in order to promote transparency, accountability, and ethical business practice. So as you're listening today, you're going to hear about a range of helpful tips, approaches, and strategies that companies, organizations, and you, as a player in the built infrastructure industry, can apply in the fight against corruption. We've assembled an excellent and knowledgeable panel of speakers today to help guide us through what can often be a complex, complicated, and very challenging to define issue. Our panelists are experts in their fields, and each of them have experienced corruption at the sharp end of the stick. And very critically, they're working on a daily basis to combat it and give all of us tools to do the same. One of the things that I'm very proud of is to have colleagues like Nigel, Cecilia, Jackie, Bruce, and many others of you who've joined us in earlier panels, as well as conversations throughout the years on integrity, to work with all of you in the fight against corruption and just rooting this issue out at all levels of the industry. A couple of thoughts about how we're going to manage the logistics before I get into a quick level set and then turn things over to the panelists who I know you're here to listen to. We have a chat function in the at the bottom of your screen. Please use it to ask questions throughout the presentation. After we hear from our panelists, we will have a moderated Q&A session, and then we'll wrap up for some closing thoughts, let you get on your way in approximately 86 minutes. So this will be a 90-minute webinar, and we're going to hold to that time. But please feel free to ask any questions that come up. We will prioritize the questions in the chat, and we really do look forward to a robust conversation with everybody that's joined us today. On an issue like corruption, even simple questions are important to reinforce concepts, the ideas and themes behind them, because the more that we shed light on issues related to fraud, corruption, and the challenges that face us when we try to make sure that we're working with integrity, regardless of our business sector, we can get to the root of the problem and we can solve it together. So after having given you a couple of brief comments, I want to share some thoughts related to something that you will hear about today, which is the Global Integrity Report that EY has put together, as well as a reminder on what International Anti-Corruption Day in 2024 is all about. This year, the United Nations has chosen to focus on youth. With 1.8 billion young people around the world, this is an important part of our global community who has the ability to raise its voice in the fight against corruption. We've seen young people demand change and accountability, whether it's through their advocacy, their use of technology, and even use of social influencing panels, applications, and programs around the world to demand that leaders hold themselves accountable and hold themselves to doing their jobs with the integrity that's necessary in order to advance humanity. However, there still remain a lot of challenges, and you're going to hear about some of them today, as well as some of the solutions that we might consider in that fight. One of the things that came out of the EY survey in 2024 is that, unfortunately, people are ready to misbehave. Nearly 4 in 10 of the respondents to that global report and that global survey said that they would be prepared to sacrifice their integrity and their ethics if they were able to benefit personally or financially from a corrupt situation. Second, this misconduct is also influenced heavily by leadership. Whereas in the recipients of that survey, 25% of the employees of firms felt that way. When you look at board members, that number rises to 2 in 3. Senior leadership in firms, it's over 50%. So there's a challenge with our leadership in terms of their commitment to integrity and their commitment to personal ethics. Part of that challenge is that leaders are under pressure to not report things. Again, board members, 2 in 3 feel that they're under pressure not to report a lapse of ethics by an employee in their firm. Even 57% of senior managers and senior leaders feel the same way. So that really presents a big challenge. And then finally, there appears to be a lack of training and a lack of awareness in the community that supports opportunities for integrity lapses to take place. Of those recipients of the survey under the EY Global Integrity Report, 54% felt that a lack of awareness and a lack of training contributed to these challenges and to the opportunities for corruption. And as you'll hear from Nigel, from Jackie, from Cecilia, and from Bruce, the challenge is large, and the opportunity before us is substantial in terms of moving things in a successful direction. So again, you'll hear from everybody in order. Nigel will be speaking to you from Norway, Jackie from the United States, Cecilia from Peru, and Bruce from Australia. So before we get into the speaking, I'd like to pull up a panel or a panel poll for everybody to respond to. You can certainly respond in the poll when it comes up. If we could get that poll up, please. We'd like to get your thoughts on who everybody feels is most vulnerable to corruption in your firm. Is it the senior leadership or the C-suite, board of directors level, mid-career professionals, folks of 15 years or more, early career professionals, certainly probably up to about 10 to 12 years of experience, or the people who might be working out in the field, construction management or construction staff? So please feel free to go ahead and respond to that question and poll, and I'll certainly share the responses here in a few seconds. We'll give everybody 5 to 10 more seconds just to get those responses in. And then if we could get that response to come up. So what we're showing is that of the people who've responded, nearly half feel it's that senior leadership who are most vulnerable, followed by staff in the field, and then trailing mid-career and early career professionals. And this does track with some of the findings that we've seen where there is a significant perception that the senior leaders are the most vulnerable. So thanks for your thoughts early on. And with that, I would like to turn things over to my colleagues and give them an opportunity to share their thoughts. So Nigel, floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Richard. And hello, everyone, and welcome to UN International Anti-Corruption Day, which I would like to maybe call your Defense Against the Commercial Dark Arts Day. My name's Nigel Iyer. I've been a fraud investigator for far too long. I think I started when I was 25 and I'm now 60. I've worked in most countries around the world, and for my sins, I've been a teacher at different business schools to executive management. I totally agree with that poll that just came out just now. And Richard told me I should mention I've also written a few books. My last book was definitely the most populist and probably aimed at the young. So the youth and as I said, we believe the children are our future. So I think that's a little bit about my background. What I'm going to take you through is 7 minutes of exercise, really, which is kind of morning gymnastics, how everyone can become a fraud detective, how everyone in the world can actually play their part in defending their organization against the commercial dark arts. So maybe we can have the next slide, please. Next. Yes. In my book, what I've realized over 35 years is that the world of detecting and preventing fraud and corruption became a specialist profession. Many things happened in the last 30 to 40 years, which have been taking away the empowerment of normal individuals to actually stop corruption and fraud. And one of the things that has been done is making it too complicated. So what I did in my book was create this wheel, and it's been vetted by a number of what I call experts in the international field who said they call it the wheel of misfortune, but actually it's the wheel of fortune. The cost of fraud and corruption, if you define it as anything deliberate done by anyone, external or internal, which causes harm, and harm being damage to the organization, damage to its culture, damage to value or profits, and damage to reputation. Typically, that's been measured to by the OECD, around 5% of world GDP. In the infrastructure industry, some estimates are pushing it as far as 10% of external spend or revenue. It's a huge chunk of change. But what's it made up of? Here are 7 examples, and I think 7 almost all-encompassing examples, because you could say suppliers and consultants taking advantage. So something we don't always think of as fraud and corruption is when someone constantly overcharges us and they get away with it. Well, actually, it's deliberate, it's unethical. Customers can also get away with far too much. There can be creeping in all sorts of under and overstatement and misleading documents, everything from investment fraud all the way to we'll do this in no time for you, here's the proof, and then it costs 10 times as much. All forms of kickbacks, elegant forms of bribery. I would say dirty money is all over the world. The Panama Papers was maybe a wake-up call, but actually it was a wake-up call to all the places that hide people's money to do it a bit better. Then you've got the one which some people talk about corruption, which is the insiders, misuse of the organization by employees and management for their own ends. And then you have a catch-all category, which is unethical behavior by anyone else. And all that really amounts to a large amount of money and reputation that's lost every year. But I wanted to give an example to you, and I want to move on to that straight away, because my belief is that every single person in the world can be a fraud detective. You don't have to be an auditor. You don't have to be an accountant or a regulator or a policeman or even a whistleblower. We can actually find it and spot it well before the whistleblower. Now I'm going to try an experiment using you as my audience. If we can go to the next slide, please. I'm going to give you a scenario, and it's a building scenario, and it's in our zone. And I would like everyone to answer the poll when we come to the poll, which is, we'll get onto that in a minute. Richard also said something about me, that I'm also known for cheesy movie references in my talks. Already, you may have spotted one. We'll move on to the next one in a minute. But let's say our organization has a building contractor. It's a new supplier from May this year, but it's already invoiced our organization for $1 million in this year. The address, 7 Tom Roopdandel Street, Borchester. Okay, it's a case study, so it doesn't exist. It has an address, and the invoice reference is justin@gmail.com. Maybe you already see some red flags already, but let's move on now. If you take the next slide, please. Okay, I hope you can all read that, but I'll read it in case you're actually sitting in your car and you don't want to look at the screen because you'll crash, which is also not a good thing to do. It's a building contractor, new supplier from May 2024. It's already organized, invoiced us for 1 million. Its address is 7A Tom Roopdandel Street, which you can put into Google Maps, and you see that it's actually that apartment building on the first, or depending on where you are in Europe, the second floor of the building where the X is. You do a quick look on LinkedIn, and LinkedIn says this company has 2 to 5 employees, which is a typical LinkedIn category. You have a look on UK Companies House, and the company has a share capital of £1,000, but was registered on the 1st of May 2024. And it's got a website, the usual Google stuff, and just for a building contractor, 4.6 Google reviews. Bit interesting. And the invoice address happens to be a Gmail address. And then you see the invoice number patterns, which I hope you can read. The invoice numbers look like they're in a sequence almost. And the first invoice was on the 2nd of May, which is possibly interesting because it was the day after it was registered. This company, oh, and the car is, it just happened when you were Googling it that you actually found out that the company does own a Porsche. But, you know, they are green. It is an electric Porsche. So probably quite good for carrying materials around. Now, my question to you is going to be, apart from saying, I've got a bad feeling about this, what do you think could be going on with now you have this information in your hands? I was going to say in your face, but it's actually you who created it. You have this information because you showed a healthy sense of curiosity to Google the address. So what do you think could be going on? Maybe we can put the poll up now. You can think about it. It could be nothing at all. It's all good, man. Or it's a newly started company. It seems to have won a large contract with us. Maybe without a competitive tender because it happened so fast. Could be overcharging. Oh, you can tick all the boxes if you want. These are you can tick all the squares if you like. Green Brothers could be a front company for someone else, maybe even illegal labor, or there could be someone on the inside. I'd really like you to answer this with your gut feeling. Be brave, show your fantasy, say that it could be. And if you think there's something else happening that is not on the poll, because I couldn't put all the possible options, feel free to put it in the chat. Okay, let's see how many poll responses have we got, because once we get to about 30, 40, let's see what people think. Are we there? Wow, that's very, very interesting. Now, I think that's worth looking at. It could be all good. I was about to say best case, worst case. It could be all good. Like what's our friend said in Better Call Saul? It's all good, man. It could be all good, but that is almost the thing you would say if you are being conned. It's all good. It's the approach that we say. Okay, all these things could be true, but the most important thing you've all shown me now is that everyone can be a fraud detective, which is super important. Everyone on the front line is a fraud detective because if we go to the next slide, please. What has happened, and now I'm going to be a little controversial. Oh, I don't know if anyone spotted the film references, but also it was just accidental, but Tom Roopdandel, the name of the street, is an anagram of the name Donald Trump. But that's just a complete coincidence because there are coincidences. But what really happens in the world? What I've seen, and this is my personal view, is that people are sticking their heads in the sand. And I mean top management, which is why they're vulnerable, actually, because we're sticking our heads in the sand because we believe somebody else is spotting fraud and corruption for us. The other thing is we're waiting for the whistleblower. Those two key elements have meant that fundamentally the cost of fraud and corruption in the world has gone so high. Hence, we need United Nations Defense Against the Dark Arts or International Anti-Fraud and Corruption Day. Actually, every day is International Anti-Fraud and Corruption Day. So really moving on to some tips, if we go to the next slide, please. What we really need to do is ignore this one. We all tick the box. We all often tick something to say, I've read the terms and conditions, but none of us read it. That is not a defense. True defenses are taking charge, being on the front line, doing exactly what you did in that case study. You proved it, you can do it, you can see it. That's the way to go. What else can we say? healthy curiosity, look. And the last tip is think like a criminal. Think that people on the outside are there to attack our organization. That's why fraud and corruption happens. How can we outthink them? How can we defend against them? Next slide, please. And the last thing I really want to say is there was a playwright called Oscar Wilde. He died a few years ago, many years ago. He used to be famous for his catchphrases. If he'd lived today, he would say, there's only one thing worse than finding fraud and corruption, and that is not finding it. Thank you very much. Thanks, Richard.
Great. Nigel, thank you very much for taking us through that example, showing that each of us has the ability to detect fraud, and that each of us has a responsibility to find it and to root it out. So you mentioned waiting for the whistleblower, and that many of us sometimes fall back on that as a strategy or a way for leadership to put its head in the sand. And whistleblowing is something that came up in both of the earlier webinars, and we've had several people on this panel who have been whistleblowers. So I'd like to now give Jacqueline Garrick an opportunity to speak to you. So I'll allow Jackie to introduce herself and the perspective she's bringing to this panel. So Jackie, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I feel like a little bit of a duck out of water because I'm a social worker by background. You wouldn't want me to build or do anything of the sorts. But I was really interested in what Nigel just said with his wheel, because that's where my story started as a whistleblower. I was a government employee and I was running the Defense Suicide Prevention Office, not anything at all to do with fraud detection, but we had contracts. And at one point, I had somebody come to me and want me to take the contracts that I had to move the money to a different company where she had been vice president and her husband was sub to the prime. I found that part out a little bit later. So when you were talking about that misuse for personal gain, that struck a chord because that's my story, and it made me have to learn a lot about whistleblowing very quickly and take on this role that was very disconcerting. So again, it was from a place of not having any experience in whistleblowing or in fraud or in anti-corruption. I mean, those words weren't even in my vocabulary. I just knew we got FAR training, federal acquisition, regulation requirements. I did what I thought I was supposed to do. I was not prepared for the boomerang that hit me later. And I think that is a really important piece of this when we start thinking about how people are acclimating themselves to their corporate culture, what's their own propensity. And I'm, that's what I do most of the time is I'm very interested in the mindset. Next slide. So I started Whistleblowers of America because I was lonely and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who I was supposed to talk to. I didn't understand any of this. And then it was one day I had connected with somebody on LinkedIn after having posted some things about whistleblowing and retaliation and the mental health aspects that I was sorting out myself. And I connected with this she was another federal employee from federal law enforcement, actually. And as we're talking, she says to me, I have a gun and I'm ready to kill myself. And she said it was sitting on the table in front of her. And I thought, wait, I know how to do this part. I might not know much about fraud detection, but I can help survivors because that's what I spent most of my career doing. I was an Army social work officer, spent most of my career working with post-traumatic stress disorder and suicide prevention with the military. I was at the Pentagon when my story happened. So I felt like there was this space, this gap in the literature And I started to research what I eventually started to call the toxic tactics of retaliation, and began to identify things like gaslighting, marginalizing, mobbing, shunning. That that was the counter to, I think, what we saw in the polls earlier, where you see at the most corrupt level, you've got your senior executives and your C-suite. But then as you drill into that, you see where there is the mid and lower level employees, sometimes the ones who are the sort of the boots on the ground walking around a construction site going, well, wait, where are all the materials? Where's the protective gear? Those are the folks who see the corruption first and will do their best to identify it, and again, thinking you're doing the right thing, thinking you're professional, you're trained, this is what I'm supposed to do. For some of my whistleblowers, like in the healthcare industry, we're mandated reporters. We're supposed to make these disclosures when we see harm to patients, wrongful deaths. I mean, these are our jobs. So the idea that we're supposed to do those things, and yet we suffer that retaliation. I call it the boomerang effect. So you see something wrong, you know, people are getting hurt, airplanes are falling out of the sky, and you do something about it, and then you retaliate against. And I've referred to that as sort of the 1-2 punch. The first aspect of the trauma is seeing the airplanes fall out of the sky. The second part of the trauma is being victimized as an employee because what you did was tell the truth that nobody wanted to hear. And I started Whistleblowers of America in 2017, and we are now connecting to over 1,100 people in 30 countries. That was not my expectation. And we're a small nonprofit. We're a peer support network. So we're connecting people. It's very much creating a database and just trying to help people who have had similar cases. So like if I did have an engineer whistleblower, I would look in my database for another engineer whistleblower, make kind of an assessment of how is that person doing with their case, and then match them together. Next slide. So I thought it was also very interesting when I was asked to do this, and that there was supposed to be a sort of this focus on young people. So what I did after my first book came out, which I think is the next slide, but we'll come to that. What I started to do is presentations on my toxic tactics of retaliation. I started traveling, and we started having just lots of conversations about how do we prevent corruption so that people are feeling more prepared and ready to engage. So you have this gap. Remember, it was the C-suite people who are committing the corruption. It's the lower level employees that are seeing it. So how do we close that gap a little bit so that you have more integrity in the people who will promote up, right? I mean, you have to think about this from the chronological perspective, that those young people are eventually going to be corporate leaders if they stay in a field long enough. And if you're, you know, like us social workers, you invest in your career. If you're an engineer or construction worker, you invested in your career. It's not likely that you're leaving the industry you were in. So how do you get to these young people? And when we first started Whistleblowers of America, I kind of, people said to me, don't use the whistle on anything. You'll notice it's not on our logo. It's not really in anything we use overly, because whistleblowers feel like, I'm not shrill, I wasn't loud, I reported, I did what I was supposed to. And the whistle seems like a contraindication of what they did. So I said, okay, well, we'll be like giraffes, because we stand tall, we stick our necks out, the, to stick your neck out means you risk criticism. So I started by using the giraffe, and these are our little mascots that we give out to people. And the idea of talking about we're like giraffes, we stand tall, we stick our necks out, we admire the spots of others. I came up with this mantra, and we developed this book because we really thought, well, the best way to end corruption is to get young people engaged in this conversation while they're still in high school, college, early career. And we created this very fun kind of book that looks like a graphic novel, so that it's engaging, it's accessible, it doesn't feel overwhelming or boring. So that you talk about ethics and integrity from the perspective of Ubuntu, who was the giraffe. And for those of you maybe who are in Africa or South Africa, Ubuntu is the expression that means I am because we are, that everyone in humanity is responsible for taking care of community. So we need to teach the skills for building moral community. And I think that became sort of an important piece of this because, next slide, because of these psychosocial impacts of whistleblower retaliation. So this was after doing a few articles and doing some research and some studies myself, again, I mentioned the toxic tactics, the gaslighting, mobbing, marginalizing, devaluing, shunning, bullying. We found that employees who went through this continue to suffer, and they suffer along many psychosocial domains. Um, they become unemployed or underemployed. After I made my disclosure, I ended up removed from my job by the person I made my disclosure about. And then the system didn't protect me. I had to learn a lot of things on my own. So it was isolating, stunning, and I began to feel very stressed, lots of anxiety. I've spent a career helping people with their anxiety. So when I started having these conversations and connecting, we created a survey so that everybody could participate in sharing what their experiences was along those domains. So it's 9 domains and about 75 indicators, and we came up with these results. And that was the survey. We analyzed that data, and that's the basis of this book, is looking at those psychosocials. And so the underemployment, the unemployment were factors. Lost my job. I spent almost 2 years, did like 90 applications, but because my resume and what I was doing was now very mismatched, I had been removed from a very high position. There were these strikes against me, and the rumor mill and the appearance that I was the one who had done something wrong because I was the one who got moved, not the people who were perpetrating the corruption. Um, and what happened to the suicide prevention office after that was kind of looked away, like people didn't pay attention. Like, wait, we were having these results, this much money, but now all of a sudden there's a lot less money in this program, and the results are not good, right? So removing me didn't improve results. But that's that kind of mismatch in the narrative. Lost my house. We see housing insecurity, food insecurity, socioeconomic status gets very impaired because you are responsible for your case. No one steps in, and I've talked to people in several countries. If you're the whistleblower, you're the one out of pocket. So you may know a building is going to collapse, or planes are going to fall out of the sky, or patients are going to be harmed, but no, you're the one out of your own pocket defending against these ills. So you spend down which what does that do, right? You lose your investment portfolio. You're taking money out of your bank accounts, your college fund for your kids. People are going hungry. They're losing their homes. They're selling their cars. They really take on, and we find even decades and decades later, they don't ever catch back up to where they would have been if they hadn't been whistleblowers. So there is a lot of incentive not to stand tall, not to stick your neck out, because there are some real losses. And we see in the media what happens to whistleblowers and the kinds of retaliation that they suffer. Next slide. So we created this Workplace Promise Institute to try to, one, bring together whistleblowers because they need that healing. They need to make that connection. We try to help educate them on what resources are out there, how they can, stay strong in this fight, how to connect them with attorneys, media, elected officials, with each other. I find that has been really, really healing for them. And of course, we don't charge whistleblowers for any of the peer support. I started this as a suicide prevention activity so that we didn't want there to be a wrong door. We didn't want somebody to feel like there was no avenue, there was no help, there was no support. They are flailing when we get them. They are so demoralized. I mean, we often start a conversation. I'll say, so I'm Jackie Garrick. I'm the founder of Whistleblowers America. Tell me your story. And then I don't say anything for like another half an hour. And there's a lot of anger, tears, frustration, loss, depression, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and anxiety that we're dealing with. So we really do count on building this moral community around the whistleblower and trying to make sure that that they're taken care of. So I know I think I'm at time and I don't want to go over, but happily to answer questions when the time comes.
Jackie, thank you very much for sharing your story and sharing the story of Whistleblowers of America. The fact that it's working internationally and that you're able to provide support across a variety of sectors is incredibly valuable. And then certainly building upon what Nigel has shared with us about the fact that everyone can detect fraud, and that's a scary thing to do. It can, especially in emerging economies where your life, your family may be at risk. Taking on that responsibility is extremely serious. So
yes, we can remember Babita Decoran in South Africa, who was shot in her driveway, and a government employee. I mean, I relate to her story for that reason. Government employee doing her job, murdered in her driveway.
Jackie, thanks for again sharing that the story that of the consequences that can face people who blow the whistle, and the fortitude and the courage that it takes to do that. What I'd like to do now is rotate over to Cecilia Melzi and give her an opportunity to talk about again the level setting importance of why integrity is important, what we can do to prevent whistleblowing from having to occur in the first place, and really helping us all understand things that we can do in an organization to promote integrity and promote doing the right thing. So Cecilia, thanks for joining us today, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much all for being here, and thank you to FIDIC for the invitation. So this is the third webinar of the FIDIC series that I have been invited, and I'm very happy to be here with you today, December 9th, as was mentioned by Richard, International Anti-Corruption Day, and share with you some insights and key advice for making the anti-corruption programs that are implemented in companies not just a check on the box, because that's easy to do, but being effective and generate value to companies. So just as a quick introduction, I am a partner of the forensics practice of EY in Peru, I have more than 20 years of experience in EY, and I have been in charge of designing and implementing compliance programs, and also with a strong experience in investigations related to corruption, antitrust, and other types of fraud. As I mentioned, I am located in Peru, but I work very closely with other EY teams and clients in all Latin America and US and worldwide. So first, I want to start with a simple definition of integrity. What is integrity? Integrity, according to the Harvard professor Michael Jensen, is the condition to be complete, to be entire, without damage, in perfect states. And this happens when the word of a person is complete. And the word of a person is complete when the person honors its words and comply with the commitment that the person has with its stakeholders. So if we talk about that, if we transfer that to our organization, for our organization is the same. To have integrity is to comply with the commitments that the company has with its stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders of a company? The clients, the employees, the regulators, the stockholders, suppliers, among others. So remember, integrity is to comply with the commitments that the company has with its stakeholders. And those commitments could be obligations, norms, laws that the company has to comply, but also could be voluntary. And the compliance program's objective is helping in establishing how the persons in the company should behave. These programs could help in promote the generation of an ethics culture and modify conducts and take good decisions. Integrity becomes an habit in the way we do business, not just thinking in a short-term benefit, but considering the long-term impact and the reputation in each decision we made. But which should the message to the organization in order to launch a compliance programs? Which should be the message? I consider it's not a good message to the organization to say that a compliance program is being built due to the regulations, to comply with norms, and due to the company wants to avoid problems. Of course, that information is true. Companies want to avoid problems and want to avoid problems and comply with regulations. But the key message to spread in the organization is to do the right thing due to integrity is a key strategic value of the organization. Acting in a right manner and with integrity is the way how the company does things, not tolerating any wrongdoing. Of course, as an accessory consequence, the company is going to comply with regulations and avoid problems, but that is not the most important trigger to start developing and implementing strong compliance programs. The most important trigger is to behave with integrity, because that's our DNA. So some key points that I want to share with you to take into account in order, I consider, for the compliance programs to be effective are, I want to share four thoughts. First is to count with a compliance officer that is fully dedicated and with the corresponding empowerment, autonomy, independence, and direct report line to the board of directors. A compliance officer should be invited to the strategic meetings and be involved in the important decision, not just be a figurehead. Also, the second point is to have a robust and solid process of whistleblowing, with a clear message of no retaliation, maintaining the confidentiality and anonymity if required by the whistleblower. This process implies since the moment that someone is receiving the information until how it's filtered, how it's escalated, and how the matter is investigated to take the corresponding actions. In this topic, I want to mention some statistics and figures from two sources. I'm talking about whistleblower, right? The first source are statistics about the whistleblower hotline service that we offer in EY. At EY Peru, we handle the service of managing whistleblower hotlines for all over the world in EY. We have more than 200 clients. And I want to share some interesting information about last year's results. 74% in average of the reports were anonymous, which emphasize the importance of providing several independent channels that allow reporters to not give their contact information if they do not want to. About the main channels used, the most used were web page, which 49%, and then email, which 25%. And 60% of the reporters were employees. The other 40% were third parties, were suppliers, were clients, etc. The second source of information for this interesting topic are the results of the EY Global Integrity Report that was mentioned by Richard at the beginning, launched in 2024. If we compared the results now to the 2022 survey results, organizations without a whistleblowing hotline have halved, which are excellent news. But there is a disconnection between board members, senior management, and lower level employees regarding perceived confidence in these tools. For example, 40% of board members think it's easier now to report concerns, against just 25% of other employees thinking the same. So can you compare 40% of board members against just 25% of other employees thinking that it's easier now to report concerns? 42% of senior management think that now there are more possibilities to raise concerns with anonymity, versus 18% of low and middle level employees thinking the same. And besides this inconsistency of what the board members or top management think versus the middle and low level employees, the most shocking results I consider are related to the number of employees reporting has decreased in the last 2 years. When compared to our 2022 results, respondents' use of whistleblowing hotlines was approximately 17% less at a global level. And when we ask for the reasons why the respondents of the survey chose not to speak up, the top reasons mentioned include that they felt there was no other responsibility, they felt pressure from management, they felt fear of their personal safety, future career concerns, or they felt that their concerns were not acted upon anyway. So these are really some alarming statistics and a call for actions for organizations to build a culture where people really feel comfortable across ranks to speak up if they have concerns and without fear of retaliation. So in this context, how important is to have a whistleblower program that really works, right? It is critical. And more important, what means that a whistleblower program really works? We consider that it means that the reports should arrive to an independent ethics committee, means that the confidentiality could not be breached, so anyone besides the correspondent ones cannot know about the information received. And if required, the anonymity will be respected, so never should be a condition for someone to report to give her or his name. Also means that a formal procedure should be established to receive reports, to filter them, and start the proper investigation. Also, we consider it key that a clear policy of no retaliation must exist, with a specific name of a policy of no retaliation. This is really important. And of course, after the investigation is concluded and based on the results, the company should take the corresponding actions. Training sessions should be given for all employees to understand that it's not only important to do the right things, but to not omit if they know something bad is happening. And finally, how the company can make that the whistleblower will be known for all. Maybe since town hall meetings, focus on integrity and have as one of the topics the whistleblower, to publishing statistics in the intranet or in the company bulletins related to how many reports have been received, how have they been addressed, and permanent trainings to all employees. So I have talked about the compliance officer, I have talked about the whistleblower hotline, and just to finish, I also want to strengthen the importance of the procedures about due diligence of third parties. Interesting results also are provided by the EY Global Integrity Report. Globally, 85% indicated that they trust that the third parties who they are working with show integrity in the work they do, but just 35% indicated that their organization have procedures to perform due diligence to these third parties, as for example, trainings to their personnel to perform the corresponding due diligence. So is this an excess of trust? I think so, because 85% is trusting in their third parties, but just 35% are doing something to be sure that this is true, right? So in the fight against corruption, it is key to perform exhaustive due diligence for the third parties that needed that. Not all, of course, but there are third parties that expose to more corruption risk than others. The due diligence is to perform a reputational background check, and based on the results, using, for example, technology to calculate the scores of each third party, and based on that result or that scores, trigger certain approvals. The due diligence is key and should be made thoroughly and based on the risk level, and also, of course, efficiently to not generate disruptions in the commercial processes. And remembering the biggest case of corruption in Latin America, the lavajato or the car wash, all of you may remember that this was related to a Brazilian construction company that involved several other companies in a lot of countries. These companies were paying bribes to public officers in governments to win construction companies. And what could have been the origin of this situation for the construction companies in each of the country was that they did not perform proper due diligence before accepting participating consortiums, joint ventures with the Brazilian construction company. So in the construction sector, which are the risky areas in relation to corruption? Interaction with third parties, use of agents to get business with governments, interactions with public officers, donation, gifts, and conflict of interest with contractors, considering the big volume of transactions due to the intensive capital expenses of the sector. So in all these 4 risky areas, the third parties are involved. So we consider the due diligence is indispensable. Last but not least, the importance of not only have an excellent tone of the top, which is related to give the right message since the highest level, but to have the conduct at the top. Now the tone of the top is not enough. To have the conduct at the top, which is the example of doing the right things as the way how we do things, because it's in our DNA to be honest and to work with integrity. This is what I want to comment about some trends, figures, and key advice to fight against corruption. So that's from my side, Richard. Thank you.
Cecilia, thank you very much for your comments on integrity, some of the findings from your report, as well as just reminding everybody that people have a desire to want to believe that others will do the right things. Nigel's shown us that the tools exist to allow us to do that due diligence, to be our own fraud detectors. And both you and Jackie talked about just how challenging the whistleblowing process can be. And you've started to address some of the questions that we've seen on the whistleblowing process. Now I want to give Bruce an opportunity to talk to us about some of the corruption in the construction sector that he's seen, and specifically how it affects emerging economies and vulnerable populations. And then after Bruce's comments, we'll get into addressing some of the questions that are starting to appear in the chat. So Bruce, thanks for being with us today, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this important topic as well.
Thanks very much, Richard. And thank you, everyone, for participating in Anti-Corruption Day. I have a background in structural engineering. I've been a structural engineer for 40 years, and I've managed an engineering consultancy for the past 25 years. It's spanned across Australia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and has included India and China. And I've spent a lot of my career working in developing countries right across the region. I've been responsible for some 350 engineering staff, both from a technical point of view, but also when they've had to face corruption-related issues, when they've been approached with bribes and facilitation payments and the like. I've also been in a very dangerous situation where I was a whistleblower. So it would have been great to talk to Jacqueline at the time, but it was quite a while ago. But it can be a very stressful situation. And also in developing countries, there is a habit of a lot of young engineers, for instance, in India have been murdered. So it's a very dangerous scenario in some countries, and that needs to be taken into account when you're getting advice. Anyway, today I'm taking a slightly different discussion point. Rather than talking specifically about whistleblowing, I want to talk more generally about the construction industry overall. And I'd like to start with providing some positive global statistics. The positive global statistics, so we go to the first slide, is that in infant mortality, which is children dying before the age of 5, was 10% in 1970, and over the past 50 years, it's dropped to 2.6%. The global average life expectancy of the population around the world in 1970 was 56 years of age. Today, it's 73. The population in extreme poverty in 1970 was 2.2 billion people, and now it's 736 million people. So you'd be thinking, this is all, it is really good, and you'd be feeling pretty positive about it. But also, if you look closely at some areas, there's, for instance, 429 million Africans who live in extreme poverty and 129 million Indians who are living in extreme poverty. So there's been advances in agriculture, medicine, and vaccines that have done an amazing thing to improve humanity and health outcomes. But those improvements are not uniform, and some places are left way behind. So there is a reason to be worried. High infant mortality, short life expectancy, and extreme poverty all correlate with hotspots of corruption. These hotspots for corruption and extreme poverty in Africa and South Asia are not improving. Countries that are involved in civil or international wars are the most corrupt, such as Somalia, Afghanistan, and Syria. Can you see the paradox? In many ways, humanity has progressed remarkably in the past 50 years, yet tragically, corruption continues to condemn 736 million people to terrible hardship. What I'd like to do is move on to the next slide, but have a look at what that means in terms of the construction industry. The construction sector is the world's most corrupt industrial sector. The Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors provided an estimate that the annual cost of global corruption will hit US $5 trillion by 2030. I was actually astounded when I heard this number. 5 trillion to me is almost indescribable. So I tried to break it down. Basically, $1 billion is what it costs for a 40-story condominium in Florida or Singapore. So $5 trillion is equivalent to 5,000 40-story condominiums per year. And putting that into perspective, Manhattan, New York City and Manhattan has 6,400 buildings. So you're building close to building a Manhattan every year out of corruption around the world. And it's not just corruption in building construction, it's in roads, it's in infrastructure, it's in dams, it's in all sorts of things. But as a global total, the number is absolutely massive. So it's worthwhile bearing that in mind. The death toll from corrupt construction is around 100,000 people per year. So that's equivalent almost to the death toll from warfare. You think about how many people are dying in, unfortunately, very unfortunately, in both Ukraine and Gaza at the moment, and you spread that over the past decade, you'd find that corruption from the construction sector is killing almost as many people. Just in 2023, 2 events occurred. In February, there was an earthquake in Turkey and Syria where 59,000 people died in one day. And most of those deaths were attributed to buildings that had been constructed without seismic reinforcement in them or seismic bracing in them. They had design codes and standards to have the seismic bracing in, but for cost cutting, the construction sector cut corners and they were left out. And so these buildings collapsed like pancakes, squashing everybody inside. In September last year as well, somewhere between 14,000 people and 24,000 people died in Derna in Libya when 2 dams collapsed. The dams were built in the 1970s and they were required to be maintained, and money was allocated for maintenance and upgrades, but those funds were embezzled, so the maintenance upgrades never occurred. Under heavy rainfall, both dams gave way and they washed all these people into the Mediterranean. So putting this whole situation simply, we've got a $5 trillion problem and around 100,000 people dying per year. Plus, we've got a legacy of buildings and infrastructure that has been built by corrupt contractors with defects in it. So it is a massive problem. What I'd like to do is we move to the next slide and have a think about how we might challenge it, how we might tackle this challenge. I think, first of all, it's important to recognize that we can't do something like tackling such a massive level of corruption in isolation. So we need to use all available resources as effectively as possible. So we need to move effectively from a piecemeal approach to an integrated approach. For example, on this slide, you'll see there's 6 organisations on the right-hand side that are present in Australia. And up till recently, they've all been functioning independently. But what we're now looking at doing is integrating so that we're sharing our resources, helping each other, but also looking at gaps between our different organisations and the anti-corruption tools and resources that we're developing to what's needed in the community. So it's basically a matter of how can we use our combined resources as effectively as possible. And then the next stage of it is moving from being disconnected to a connected collaboration. And this disconnection occurs between anti-corruption organisations, universities, and enforcement agencies. So how can we all work together to come up with educational programs and resources that look at students, their needs, look at professionals as they're involved in their careers and doing continuing professional development, and then how we actually look at problems that are occurring in construction. So it's moving from this disconnected approach to all working together to help create a platform to share our resources as effectively as we can. And then the next part of it is moving from being underutilized in terms of these resources to fully implemented. So it is going to take a lot of effort to train engineers and architects, project managers and builders, both at university and in their workplace, to actually start implementing anti-corruption measures and recognise the importance of those measures. Then the final thing that we need to do is we need to look at how we're actually going to track what's going on. And we need some pretty serious KPIs around how we reduce that $5 trillion a year to a lower number, and how we reduce death tolls from corruption-related accidents. And then we need to look at how we can improve not just over years, but decades and intergenerationally, because it's a massive challenge that we face. If we can move to the next slide, I'd just like to finalise the presentation I'm giving now with just giving you some take-home things that could be done straight away, because the big picture issues involve a lot of organisations working together, but we also need to think about where we're actually working on projects, we've got staff, we're managing contracts. What can we do straight away in our everyday life? And I think the first thing is raising awareness and the need to recognise the social imperative of tackling corruption. And until I'd done studies in relation to corruption, I had no idea the magnitude of the problem that we're facing. And then we need to look at ways of collaborating and sharing information to maximise the benefits of anti-corruption education. So how can we actually work as effectively as possible to get the right information to the right people? A really good example of this is, think about young engineers. They're straight out of uni and they go to their first job. They're working on a project site, and it's really tough. They can be intimidated by a contractor, put under a lot of pressure. They can be compromised by somebody, offering to take them out for drinks and then entertainment. There's all sorts of things that go on where young engineers can go off the rails very quickly in their careers, and it's almost subliminal that it's going on. So we need to be very aware, and it's looking for ways that we can raise the standard of integrity and give them the tools to say no to inducements and make them champions of change. And we need to do that as a very important early point to their careers before they get, unfortunately, taken down the wrong path. We need to recognise and address the challenges that are created from a lack of transparency in all aspects of construction. This involves not just tender processes, but record keeping on site, test records that could be falsified, all sorts of things that go on. We need to have continue to push for transparency throughout. We need to consider the importance of the role of whistleblowers and how we better protect them. And I know that Jacqueline talked about this in a lot more detail earlier, and we can discuss that in the Q&A session. And I think really importantly, don't stand for corruption in the workplace. Instead, unfortunately, you've got to make tough choices to maintain integrity. I'd finally like to finish up just letting you know that in this sort of 8 to 10 minutes, I've covered some aspects of a book that I'd spent 10 years researching and 1.5 years writing. And it's got 15 chapters with case studies from all around the world. So there's some 32 case studies, covers 20 different countries. And it relies on links from anti-corruption organisations. So a lot of the work that I refer to in the textbook has actually been done by this huge body of people involved in anti-corruption activities, both in terms of providing tools and resources and carrying out research. And I think the really important aspect of it is there's a lot of people doing fantastic work, but somehow we need to get that work to a state where it's getting in front of engineers, telling them what to do and helping them, and then pushing things along the right track. So my aim is really, in writing a book and being involved in GIAC, or the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Centre in Australia, is to really help kickstart this integrated approach to taking on corrupt construction. Thanks very much.
Bruce, thank you very much for those comments. Thanks for sharing the research and the findings that you had. Look, from the responses I've seen in the chat, a lot of people were very, very surprised to know just how large this challenge is. We've got approximately 22 minutes before we will wrap up this webinar. So now we've got an opportunity to hear from our panelists on the questions that have been posed in the chat. I'd like to ask the panelists to keep your answers tight and concise, just so we can get through as many questions as possible. And I'm going to go back to the beginning of the questions and pose them to everyone. So starting, Nicholas Jones had asked a question about, to just the panelists, how do we feel organizations are getting with regard to protecting whistleblowers? And, Jackie provided some very sobering challenges to a would-be whistleblower, in the fact that many people are not incentivized to speak up. And Cecilia did talk about the fact that there is a better way to set those whistleblowing third-party hotlines up to protect people. So just open question to the panel. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so we always tell people, don't use those until you have talked to an attorney, that you have a strategy, and that you really have a concise what you're going to report. because even when they are anonymous, people know who the whistleblower is. It doesn't take much to figure out, well, if it's coming from this department or this sector, then it's got to be this person. And we write and we speak in a certain way that it's always there are fingerprints even in our voice and in how we write. So I have found that even when people have been anonymous, they've been outed. Very few people who have made an anonymous or confidential disclosure ever felt protected by that process. The process that makes them most protected sometimes is by being the most vocal, and we try to figure out, like, who are their allies? Should they go to the press? Should they use social media? Should they go to their elected officials? Because if they keep it or try to keep it just inside their organization, that's when we see that it gets very adversarial very quickly. And if you want to reduce the ability to make it more adversarial, it's really to start with figuring out who your allies are and if anybody else is going to support you within the company. And that is never HR. That is, those are usually the last people you want to go to. You want to look for a senior supervisor, somebody who's vested in preventing the corruption, who can maybe help you or become your ally. Because it, like I said, it gets very adversarial fast, and you are going to have to hire an attorney eventually. So I always suggest that even before you make your disclosure, you have a consult with an attorney or an elected official, somebody who can really help guide you through this process.
Maybe, Richard, if you just allow me to complement, and also taking into consideration other of the questions of the audience about how to build confidence for employees to use the whistleblower hotlines, and if it's practical to completely outsource this process. I have to say that I have been in charge of developing some hotlines for companies, and it's a really change when it's a really milestone when you change from managing internally to managing externally, right? It's not that the norm says that you have to have it externally, no, but it's a really best practice, because you give confidence and you train the people, saying that no one from the company will receive the information. And for example, in my experience, we have received some reports that says, okay, I can give to you, EY, the information, but you have to promise that you will not say who I am to the company. But we as EY know who they are, but they give us information with that like condition, right? You cannot give my name to the company. So we report to the company, to an ethics committee, totally independent. Of course, no one of the people involved in the report are in that committee, and if they are, we have a backup procedure, right, to escalate it. So be sure that no one will know, and we totally make safe the anonymous condition of the person, and that really helps to give confidence and to build trust in the tool.
But I think for that to really work, there has to be accountability for when there is retaliation. And that's the piece that I feel like is missing a lot of times, is that the whistleblower ends up on their own, usually terminated or demoted or somewhere else, and they're in this fight by themselves. And the perpetrator of the retaliation is usually promoted and moves up and has a great career, so that there's that imbalance to justice doesn't, we always talk about whistleblowing as the David versus Goliath. We need Goliath versus Goliath. We need to rebalance that. So, I mean, I think anything we can do that's more independent, that is then another entity or somebody more independent taking the side of the whistleblower and really coaching them and taking this up on their behalf is really helpful.
Yeah, can I just add a comment that there's actually two aspects that I've been considering in cases where I've been personally involved. And one is, yes, the personal side of it What does it mean to me? How am I going to be affected? And how dangerous is the situation? And the second issue is, what is actually going to happen to the incident that's been reported? Is it going to be covered up? Is it actually going to be dealt with? And it does create a dilemma that you can be in a situation where it can be very dangerous, and an internal disclosure means that the company knows that you know, and they do a cover up. So that can happen. Then the other thing that can occur is that you can then do an external disclosure, but certain governments around the world and certain enforcement agencies are infiltrated, and that can be a problem as well. So I'd suggest number one step, get advice from a really good attorney, and quite often advice is on a pro bono capacity, certainly in Australia. I assume in quite a lot of countries where law firms have got corporate social responsibility and they help whistleblowers. So getting legal advice is a really good first step, but being aware that you can't necessarily trust not only people within your company, but enforcement agencies as well.
Nigel, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I want to be a little controversial. I want to say this is not International Whistleblowing Day. This is International Anti-Corruption Day. I think we're missing the big picture. Before you argue with me, please let me just hear me out. I think I've been a whistleblower once, and it was a horrible experience. I found some allies and we solved the problem, but it went through mental health torture for 6 months. I've seen other people, I've helped whistleblowers. We shouldn't even be thinking that whistleblowers are the best way of finding fraud. I know it's been quoted in UK government guidance that Transparency International say whistleblowers are the best way to discover fraud. I think that's absolute garbage. The best way to discover fraud has already been said in this webinar today. It's training the employees, a strong wish at the top from top management that they want people to find where their organization is being attacked and talk about it, share it, report it. And my little example was there as a test to prove it, that anyone who sees red flags can spot it, so that nobody needs to be a whistleblower. And I do accept in 1% of cases, people will have to be whistleblowers, and they need to be incredibly well looked after and thanked. My one successful whistleblower case, and I think the participant is here today, ended up with, after 2 years of the guy being in threats, feeling unsafe, being thanked by the employee, by the organization for saving. But that was after it went to court for unfair dismissal and all that. But it does work, and I've seen that in 1 of 100 cases. But I don't think people should have to be whistleblowers. I think organizations should take it upon themselves to defend their organizations and do something, so the whistleblower becomes the nice exception.
Nigel, thank you very much for kind of putting a bow on this really important sub-conversation we've had about whistleblowing as one of the pieces of integrity. And, going back to some of the things Cecilia mentioned about the things that companies can put into place to encourage from the top and encourage the structures that protect people and allow them to do good work. And in effect, going back to what Bruce said, allows construction to be built in a way that protects the health, safety, and welfare of communities, both vulnerable as well as OECD nations around the world. Want to quickly go through a couple of the other comments in the chat that are not explicitly related to whistleblowing. And let's see here. We had a comment from Paul Kirui had a comment on new strategy for multinational banks, ensuring lessons learned during project implementations or designs are factored on contractual documents. So corruption is mitigated by getting the terms of reference clearer than the existence of loopholes. So I'll take a quick step on that as far as what FIDIC is doing with our review of contracts. So I'll speak a little bit on behalf of the Contracts Committee and what the Integrity Management Committee is doing. And then I'll open this up just for other thoughts from those who are working with the international funding institutions. In our work with the revisions to and updates to the contracts, the suite of contracts that FIDIC does provide for use in the built infrastructure environment, there are anti-corruption clauses that are being incorporated into the contract, and there are different statements that are being required as a contractual requirement for all parties to adhere to. So because these contracts are supported by the multilateral banks and international financing institutions, future contracts that you see through those organizations will incorporate stronger anti-corruption language and encouragement to act in an ethical and above board manner, so that, again, the work that gets contracted gets built correctly and in a way that supports the needs of the people it's being constructed for. Bruce, any thoughts in terms of what you've seen in your experience in terms of what the international funding institutions might be doing?
Yeah, look, certainly. I think that the first key to the overall puzzle is having those contract documents that are very clear and transparent, and things like schedules of rates and drawings that are quoted off. Everything is the same for each of the contractors tendering the job. The tendering processes are all done in a way that information is shared, not funneled through a certain decision maker who can then influence a tender outcome. So there's a whole series of procedures there, and there's a whole lot around financial controls. The issue that I have is that quite often corruption happens and there's no financial footprint. There's no money. It can be non-financial forms of corruption, can be material substitutions, it can be revolving doors for staff going from one company to another, or inducements that people can't track. It can also be knocking one subcontractor out of business and bringing a buddy in. So sometimes there's a whole range of different things that are going on in the construction sector that aren't really covered by a lot of traditional anti-corruption resources. And where it becomes obviously the most concerning from my point of view as a structural engineer is when those things are hidden from people and you've got no idea that, for instance, seismic bracing has been left out of a building. You know, you go and buy the building, you've got no idea. The wall might be there. It may look all okay, and it's missing and the building falls down. So there are those sorts of things that don't leave a financial footprint. And that's where it becomes really tricky in terms of thinking that we've got a tight set of contract documents, which is great. We definitely need it, but we need to do these other things as well.
Bruce, thanks for those observations. I want to go to a comment that Nicole Gagan made in her question. Is there a link between low levels of automation technology in the construction sector to the levels of corruption in our industry? And is there a way for increased levels of automation or use of technology to reduce this human and risk element? So it ties very closely to what you just mentioned. And then Nigel, I'd like your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, okay, so there is monitoring systems that are now in place and using technology that links drawings to cameras on site to materials moving around on site so that people can be tracked. The problem is there's a lot of resistance by contractors and unions certainly in Australia, and I assume it might be in other countries as well, where they actually don't want to be monitored. So there's that issue. Another really good example of the largest infrastructure project in the world was the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge. And the concrete test lab were falsifying concrete test results from the largest infrastructure project in the world. So it gives you an idea of how systemic and devious people can be. And it affects not just, you know, small, low-grade construction. It's right through the whole industry, unfortunately.
Great. Bruce, thank you. Nigel, quick thoughts, and then we'll go for some closing comments and we'll wrap things up. This has been an excellent presentation and conversation.
Quick thought on automation, if that's I don't think AI is the panacea or the magic silver bullet to save us. so far AI looking for the sort of things I took up in my example, which is really everything in construction fraud in a nutshell, is better spotted by humans with the help of computers. A good expert system or a simple tool will help lift those things to the top. But humans we're still the most creative. We're still the ones who can outthink the fraudster, and we're still the ones who can spot the things very fast. But with the help of computers, AI gives a bit too many false positives sometimes. That's not my experience.
Nigel, thank you for those thoughts. I'd like to just quickly go back in reverse order through our panelists, just to a key takeaway for everybody to think about today as we work through December 9th, International Anti-Corruption Day, and let everybody who's joined us and hung with us for the last hour and a half to go on with their day. So, Bruce, your thoughts, please.
Yes, certainly. I've got two key takeaways. The first one is you can't fix what you can't see. So it's really important that we raise awareness of all the different forms of corruption that happen in construction projects, whether it's in contracts, procurement, or actually on site and construction. So this raising of awareness is absolutely imperative if we're to tackle corrupt construction. And the second takeaway is that the size of this problem, as I mentioned before, at $5 trillion a year and 100,000 people dying, is a really massive problem. And we really all need to work very hard together to make a difference.
Bruce, thank you so much.
Thanks,
Cecilia,
Richard.
key takeaways you have for today.
Yeah, totally aligned with what just Bruce said. You cannot fix what you cannot see. So to see what is happening, I just want to reinforce the importance of the measurement, to be sure the program is not a check the box one, but that effectively works and helps. So to make the monitor is a must, right? Which monitor the compliance programs, I mean, which are the KPI that are being measured to be sure that the program works, are the right ones, are giving valuable information to decision makers. For example, the training, it is well given, the people understand the topics, the whistleblower works, the reports are being received but are being handled, the response are timely and consistent within the different levels of the organization, the due diligence is being done timely, but considering all the key criteria. So in summary, I think each company should establish indicators and measure them frequently to see, as Bruce mentioned, to see what is happening, right? And depending on the results, actions should be taken to adjust the program and to reinforce what is needed, but to always be in the circle of continuous improvement, right? And top management, as I mentioned, is key. Maybe top management is not talking about integrity, maybe there's no movement with training, maybe there's no informal meetings talking about integrity, but just having the compliance program as a checklist, it is not possible, right? We need to change that, and that is what needs to be avoided. So top management and measurement, I think, are key.
Cecilia, thank you so much. Jackie, your key takeaway from today's discussion.
So I think this comes down to organizational psychology as a core to the culture of an organization. I remember once when I was at the Pentagon, we had somebody write in their suicide note, and I hope this doesn't mean the rest of you will have to go through more training. The training is only important and works when the organizational psychology is built around it, that the employees and continuous process improvement needs to be ingrained. And I call that the workplace promise, that this idea that the workplace practices mental health safety, employee assistance, that we're our employees are part of a community. They know their neighbors. That you're building buildings where people who work for you, many times they live there. So capitalize on those incentives to be good neighbors, and that there are families that are involved in all of this too. Whistleblower families are impacted when the whistleblower is unemployed. So you're teaching a generation that are your future employees what's good business and what's bad business. And again, I come back to our be a giraffe concept, that if you're mentoring young people, and I don't mean just in your organization, but in your community and in your world, you're building that network and you're creating that organizational psychology that fosters this integrity that you want to see 20 years from now. So you can't just think about your leaders, who they are today. You have to think about the leaders that you're mentoring and who you're bringing up through your companies, through your organizations, through your governments, through your supply chain. It all has to matter. And we always have to take that moment and give pause to the resilience and the mental health of every single employee. And that's tough, but I think it's the key.
Jackie, thank you so much for your thoughts. Nigel,
Okay,
key takeaway.
I'll try to be quick. Corruption and fraud, and as I call it, the commercial dark arts, destroy lives. It destroys all of our lives. And let's face it, the change is not coming from the top. So we people who are on the front lines, which is 99% of the people in an organization who make the organization tick, we should start demanding training. We should start demanding to be listened to, that we take training, not tick box training, but that sort of training that says we can spot it. We should demand to be heard. We should demand to be allowed to work together to defend our organizations. We shouldn't call it compliance and risk analysis. We should call it defense against commercial dark arts or corruption and fraud. And we should demand our organizations to change. And if we don't, then all I can say is there are organizations in the world that want to make a change. Some UN organizations I work with are very good. Find one that really wants to make that change and work for that, and you'll be so much happier. That way we can avoid people having to stick their necks out as whistleblowers and have their necks broken.
Nigel, thank you so much. So again, to everyone that joined us today, to Nigel, Jackie, Bruce, Cecilia, and the FIDIC community, thank you for everybody's thoughts on the importance of not just International Anti-Corruption Day, but the importance of integrity, the importance of how we collectively work together, and the importance of the human element in all of this. As things become globally, technologically advanced, that sense of community, that sense of the fact that you're not alone and that there's a community able to support you is incredibly critical. We really appreciate all the comments and thoughts in the chat. We're going to get this information out to each of you regarding the statistics that were presented. Again, as you've heard, several of our, 3 of our panelists have written books on the topic, so there are resources out there. And I want to leave everybody with just one last thought. There's a saying that many of you may have heard, that if you want to go fast, go alone. And if you want to go far, go together. The fight against corruption is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And as we work together as a community, we can take positive steps to create a sector for the built environment that promotes health, safety, and welfare, promotes the integrity of the people who work in it, and builds a better place for the future. And our young people are going to lead that charge as we move forward farther into the 21st century. Thank you again for your time. Thanks for your thoughts. This webinar will be online, so please share it with others who may not have been able to join us. And I wish all of you a wonderful International Anti-Corruption Day, and best wishes to everybody for the remainder of 2024. So thank you again. And we look forward to your comments. If this has been a helpful webinar to you, please let us know. Please let FIDIC know, or let your member associations know, so that we can get to the resources to you to just help move things forward in a manner that gets us to where we need to be as a community, as a society, and as a planet, in building infrastructure that respects the rights of everyone. So thanks again. Have a wonderful day.